ba 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 ba.
There we go. So before we start with this next week's content, I want to make sure I give you guys a chance to ask any questions from what we worked on in our last session. So do you have any questions with some of those basics of strumming that we were working through? No? Sounds good. A lot of basic rehashing for some people in the last session, I'm sure. So awesome. Well, let's go ahead and start talking about strumming embellishments. And so today we're going to be talking about some of the next level techniques that you can apply to your strumming to be able to make it sound more musical and kind of tune it more for whatever you're wanting to play, which is what I think makes it really, really fun to add your own spin on things. So in our last session, we talked quite a bit about the movements that take place with strumming as we're going through. And we talked a lot about using your index finger on both the down and the up strums, kind of using the nail of the finger on that down and the pad of the finger more on that up. And today we're going to kind of open it up a little bit, pun intended, by learning how we can use different parts of the fingers to create different sounds. So in our last session, we used the nail on the down strum, and what you'll notice is that creates a little bit brighter of a sound in general. I'm just playing a C chord here, my ring finger on the 3rd fret of the A string. You can hear that just that down with the index, it's pretty bright. But when I come up with the pad of the finger, it's not so bright, right? It's a little bit more, soft. And so what we're looking for now with our strum is how can we make it just as bright as we did before? How can we make it sound that same way? And what we do is really simple. We just take our fingers, and we kind of meet them together, almost like if you were holding a guitar pick or something like that. And then you're going to, on your up strum, strike the strings with your thumb. Instead of using the index pad coming up, like we worked on in our last session, you're going to use that nail of the thumb and come up, just like this. You'll notice that's really bright. It's a really kind of in-your-face type of sound. Sounds something like this. This is such a great way to start getting more volume and brightness out of your ukulele. If you're playing with somebody on a guitar or just an acoustic setting where you can't plug in or something, this can be a really good way to keep up with some of the louder instruments. It takes some practice though to get that thumbnail to have a really good sound on those ups. You might notice that it's really kind of brittle at first, and that's normal. You want to make sure that you're relaxed enough that the thumb kind of moves a bit as it goes over the strings, but you're firm enough that it's not just flopping around. It's this really fine balance. And so when I do that up strum, it looks something like this. You can see the thumb in the same sort of position that we talked about in our last session. And as it comes up, it creates that more clicky, brighter type of sound. Now, it's really critical to keep your fingers pretty close together with this. A lot of times people are tempted to kind of keep their fingers apart and then like do their down strum like this and their up like this. And the reason why we don't want to do that is because it becomes very inexact and it's going to step on the toes of our next technique. I'll talk about that in a moment. But keeping them really close together just gives you more control with when you're playing these sort of styles. And you want that sort of volume and brightness. So let's go ahead and try this together a little bit. Let's go ahead and just do down ups with it. And let's play a little bit of a chord progression that I like to do. We're going to do a simple one. We're going to play C, and then we're going to play C major 7, which means you're just going to move to the 2nd fret on the A string. And then you're going to play C7, which means you're going to move down one more fret on the A string. And then you're going to play F add 9, which we talked about a little bit in our last session, but it's just the index finger here on the 1st fret of the E string. And we're going to play this just straight down ups with this progression, just so that you can get kind of a feel for this brighter sound. Should be something like this. 2 and 3 and 4 and switch. Switch. Now normal strumming, you can hear how much softer that index finger on the up strum is. I go back to the bright strumming and you hear those up strums become much more pronounced, much clickier. And sometimes we want that sound But sometimes we really don't, right? Because it's just too much. It's too bright. And so what we can look at is the opposite of this. Well, we were using our nail on the down strum, and that gave us a nice pop. But when we came on our up and we used the fleshy part of our finger, it was a much softer sort of tone. And so what we can do is create that same tone now with our down strum by using our thumb and the pad of the thumb on your down. So we were doing down with the index and up with the thumb to make it bright. Now we're going to go down with the thumb on the pad of the finger and then up with the index using the pad of the finger. You'll notice this will have your hand in a much more open sort of position. And that might look something like this if I just play it with a C chord a little bit. This is a little bit more challenging just on an efficiency standpoint because you see how wide the hand sort of moves, but that's okay. And you can hear it has a very different sound than the bright strumming. This is more bright, and this is more dark, right? More warm. A little side effect to this is because of the hand being kind of open like this, it oftentimes creates a little bit of what we call a swing feel. If you don't know what swing is, it's sort of like this jazzy type of sound, and you can hear it kind of rolls a bit. Instead of it being da 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 da, it's more of this da 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 da, and that's just sort of a natural thing that happens with this style of playing. So it tends to be really good for if you're playing something a little bit jazzier, which that chord progression we played just a moment ago happens to be pretty good for. So let's go ahead and try it. Again, that's that C, C major 7, C7, just moving down on the A string each time. Finally with that F add 9. And we're going to use the pads of the fingers. So the pad on the thumb going down and the pad on the index coming up should sound and look something like this. 2 and 3 and 4 and... Naturally this technique likes to swing, which is what I'm doing right now. It's such a nice relaxing sound. You know, if you're playing by yourself or maybe you're playing for a small kid who's, you know, you don't want a really bright loud sound, this is a really magical technique to use just to calm things down a bit and to make it sound a little nicer. And the swing can certainly help, but we can also try it without a swing, and that might sound something like this, where it's more of a 2 and 3 and 4 and. You can hear this is a little bit more firm with its timing. Now, when I finish this, I'm going to go to our normal strum, so the index for both, and that sounds like this. On the front, but it sounds still nice and warm on the ups. But now I'm going to go full bright, so nails both ways. Back to the more warm. You might notice it's kind of tricky to switch between these. So that's something to kind of practice and get more comfortable with as you go through it. But just doing this can open up so much with your strumming because now you have this sort of spectrum of sounds to play with. And it's amazing how big of a difference this can make in your song. You know, if you're playing something that's really upbeat, fast, and kind of in your face, you might want those nails to really be there, right? If you're playing something a little bit more punk or something like that, it's nice to have that brightness. But if you're playing something a little bit, you know, jazzier, it can sound so nice to have that all pad strum for that softness. Because this doesn't really sound as good as this for that sort of sound. Right? So it's just finding what works. And you can use this to kind of create a little bit of a story with your song and your playing too, by communicating a different emotion depending on the technique. If you start here, this is our normal strumming. This is kind of a neutral type of sound. But if I want to get more aggressive and more sound, louder and use more nail. And you can hear that that really builds it up, but maybe I want it to fall down. And if I want that, I can just use those pads. So it's a really flexible technique in how you can convey different sounds on your ukulele. In addition to this, though, this changes more of how the sound is made, right? Even though it tends to be a little bit louder with the nails, it's not that you're actually necessarily playing it louder, it's just that the nails tend to be a brighter type of sound. So with this in mind, we do want to play a bit with volume too. And the best way to play with volume is to use something that are called accents. Now in music, an accent's very simply more of an emphasis being placed on a note than others. So if we're strumming a pattern on our ukulele, whatever it might be, an accented strum would be one that we strike the strings a little bit harder than others. Whether we use the pad of our finger or the nail of our finger doesn't really matter, because we're looking more for that volume with this sort of accent. The nail does tend to be a little bit better for accenting a note, just because it tends to make the notes a little bit louder. But you can do it with a pad strum as well. And with this, a lot of people struggle doing accents because they try to just play those accented notes much louder. The secret and the trick is to try to play the notes that aren't accented just a little bit softer, and it creates more of that variation of sound. So let's go ahead and try something. What we're going to do is we're going to do an accented down strum, and then we're going to follow that up with 3 sets of down up that should be non-accented, which means a little bit softer. For now, I'm just going to use my index finger on the down and the up, our standard strum that we worked on in our last session. And I'm going to do an accented down, followed by a down, up, down, up, down, up. So it's this sort of 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and down, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. And if I play this really fast, just for the effect of being able to hear it, it sounds something like this. If I didn't do an accent, it would be something like this. You hear how that gets lost, right? It's sort of, where am I? What? That doesn't sound special, versus that sounding so much more magical. And the trick, again, is making sure that as you do that down strum louder, the subsequent strums that you do that aren't the accented strum, do them a little bit softer. It helps take the edge off that tone, and it really makes it easier to create that differential in terms of sound. And you don't have to just do it on down strums like I was doing there. You can also do it on up strums. And just like the down strum with the nail tends to work a little bit better for some of the accents, you can use your nail coming up too to create that same sort of vibe. One of my favorite things to do with a strum pattern is to take the standard down, down, up, down, up pattern that everybody knows and either loves or doesn't love, and using that second up, down, down, up, that up that's played, making that an accent. So you accent the first down, so it goes down, down, up, and then up, down, up is no longer accented, is rather just a normal note. And so the pattern might sound like this. If I play it normally, it would just be, that's fine and all, right? But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to accent that first down, and I'm going to accent the first up I play, and it sounds something like this. Isn't that crazy how big of a difference that little accent makes? And in this case, I am using the nail on that up strum, which is kind of like doing this when we first learn this stuff. It's a lot of moving pieces and can be difficult to put together. But it's really getting comfortable with getting that sense of a louder strum combined with softer strums to, again, create different emotions through our strumming. And it's remarkable how just using different pieces of your fingers to strike the strings and different amounts of force when you strike them, how big of a difference that can make to your strumming. And it's really a much more advanced technique than it seems. A lot of people think that this should be the very basics, and it's a good idea to learn this stuff early on, but somebody who has a mastery of these techniques can really create a lot of emotion with their ukulele playing, and it's really fun to watch and listen to. And even though these aren't the flashy chunks and other, sweeps and things, I think these are actually more important to learn as embellishments for the ukulele to take your strumming to that sort of next level. Now, when you're working on this is great for the right hand or the strumming hand. If you're a left-handed player, it'd be your left hand. But it doesn't help us a lot with what we're playing with our fretting hand. So what we're going to talk about now are bar chords, which is usually the first more intermediate thing people work on with playing chords. And I'll tell you right now, I don't like bar chords to this day. I've been doing this longer than I haven't in my life, and I still see a bar chord. I'm like, oof, okay, here we go. Right? They are tricky. But I do have some tricks that can make it so much easier to play. So the first bar chord we're going to work on today is going to be a B flat chord, which many people find to be their first bar chord that they find. And oftentimes they're taught to play the B flat chord something like this. They might be taught to say, hey, take your index finger, place it over the first fret of the ukulele, then take your middle finger, place it on the second fret of the C string, and then take your ring finger, place it on the third fret of the G string. And they're taught to do something like this. And then they're like, okay, that seems easy. And then they strum it. It sounds like this. What's going on? I'm doing the thing that you're saying to do. Why does this not sound very good? And the reason is very simple. It's because this is really hard to do. The first fret on the ukulele is the hardest fret to bar. If we were to take this same thing and we were to learn it up the neck, it would be much easier. But the bummer is for the B flat chord, we got to play it right here. So what we need to do is we need to maximize efficiency with this process. We need to make sure that we're not pushing any harder than we need to be and that we're getting every ounce of efficiency. So here's my tricks for this chord. First thing is this finger right here, this bar. It doesn't have to bar across all four strings. Usually we bar across all four strings when we're playing and we need sort of multiple strings covered. But in the case of this B flat chord, these two strings, my G and C strings, they're covered with my ring and my middle fingers. So what that means is that index finger can actually come down, and its only responsibility is on the E and the A strings. That finger only has to bar on those two. So if it's easier for you, you can try doing it like this. This was easier for me to take that index finger, bar it across the E and the A, and not worry about it coming across all four strings. Now, if this isn't easier for you and you feel like this is easier, that's okay. You still want to only be thinking about your E and your A strings though. When you do this, a lot of times people just start pushing with force. And what happens is their G and C strings are getting good amount of connection, but the E and the A start to lack. And those are the only ones that matter. The G and the C are already covered here. So what really helps with a bar is don't just think of pushing. Also think of a little bit of pulling. What that is if you look at my wrist, watch what I'm going to do here. I'm going to just pull it back just a little bit. And what I'm trying to do is pinch this part of my finger right here on the strings of the ukulele. And whether you do it this way with the full bar, or my personal favorite with only these two, you're pushing and then you pull back a little to pinch over those strings. And it is remarkable how big of a difference this can make to your chord. If I play a B flat where I'm only pushing, it might sound like this. It's not right? That doesn't sound great. That's because right now I'm only pushing this way. I'm only just taking the tip of my finger and trying to push it like a button on a remote. But now what I'm going to do is right in this area with my wrist, I'm going to pull it back just a little bit, not a lot. We don't want to come way back, but pull back just a little so that I pinch that E and that A string with that finger. And now without putting any more force, sounds good. Here it was before. It's muted, doesn't sound great. Pull back just a little bit, and we're there. I'm not pushing any harder. And even if I do it this way, same deal, pushing. Not quite right. Pull back just a little bit, and now we're getting that sort of sound. That, I think, is the biggest trick to bar chords, is knowing that you do push, but you also can pull from underneath. You're kind of giving it like torque almost, right? You're trying to pull back. And you don't want to do it too much, because if you do it too much, then these fingers fall apart, right? It's a fine balancing act. But that trick can really help make bar chords easier. Now, in addition to this, the position that your fingers are on the fretboard makes a huge difference as well. We talked in our last session about always getting right up next to the fret wire, right? So if we're looking at the B flat chord, these two fingers should be right up next to that fret wire. Well, your index finger, whether a full bar or partial, is going to want to do the same thing. You want to get right up next to that fret wire, because the further back you are, the harder it is to get a good tone. Pinch it right up next to that fret, push down a bit, pull back a bit, and you'll find that once you find that perfect balance point, you'll be able to get that connection. As far as the thumb position goes, we talked a little bit in our last session about how you can have your thumb up here as well as back. But when you're playing bar chords, it's really correct to have your thumb squared behind the neck of the ukulele, right back behind. I like to keep mine at sort of an angle like this, but it kind of depends on what I'm playing. With my B flat chord, you can see I'm like right behind the first fret here on my ukulele, with that thumb just sort of on the pad, emitting some of the pressure. And again, having that pull back a little bit, you'll find that that B flat chord gets a little bit more demystified. Now, B flat, one of the hardest chords on the ukulele because it's really difficult to push on the first fret. So what you could do, if you'd like, is you can take that B flat chord and you can move it way up somewhere else. In fact, let's for fun move it way up to right here. Let's put our index finger barred across the 3rd fret of the E and the A strings. The middle finger comes over here to the 4th fret of the C and the ring finger to the 5th fret of the G. If it's more comfortable for you, feel free to bar all the way across. It does not matter. Both ways are going to be good. And let's try that same exercise. So we push down, we also pull back just a bit, pinch that A string with our index finger using our wrist coming back, and we play it right next to the frets. And hey, what's cool is this chord right here, 5, 4, 3, 3, this is a C chord. And you can use this anytime you have a C chord. It's a very different sound than this. But you can hear they're kind of one and the same. And I like to use this C chord to practice this because it's a little bit easier to play than the B flat. But if you can play the C proficiently, you'll be able to get that B flat proficiently too, right? It's just a matter of getting comfortable with these different pieces. And that's what this is all about, is finding that comfort as you're working through. So that's a basic bar chord or B flat. Let's talk about another bar chord though. Let's talk about D7. Now to play a D7 chord, what you're going to do is take your index finger and you're going to bar it all the way across the G, C, E, and A strings. Unlike the B flat chord, this one needs to be across all 4 strings. And then we're going to take our middle finger and place it on the 3rd fret of the A string. So the index finger's responsibility is the G, C, and E strings with that middle finger there on the 3rd fret of the A. And we want to follow the same sort of concepts we were doing just a moment ago. Get right up next to that fret wire, right? Pull back a bit and add that middle finger and try to pinch to get that sound. The big difference with this chord and the B flat though is the A string is covered here. So it's more important to prioritize the G, C, and E strings with that index finger. Try moving it up a little bit or moving it down a little bit. Find that sort of area where those 3 strings can be connected really well for you. It's okay if yours looks different. Yours might be something like this, might be something like this. As long as those strings are covered and you're getting a good tone, you could be doing it right. Now, for a lot of people, this is still really difficult. And to be completely honest, I don't play a D7 like this very often. How I usually play it, still with a bar, is like this. All that I did there is I took that middle finger and I stacked it over my index finger. All that that's doing is giving us extra support. Everybody needs support. And what this middle finger is providing is the opportunity for a little extra pressure so that we can prioritize pulling back a little bit more with our hand and not lose that strength because our middle finger is providing some. Then you can take your ring finger, slide it in there on the A string on the 3rd fret, and do the same sort of thing. This is just fine of a way to play it. It's not cheating or anything like that. It works out really well to get that D7. So that's another way that you can play that D7 and approach that bar. Just to kind of recap with the bar chords, you want to get right up next to that fret wire, right? You want to make sure that you're pushing but also pulling back a bit to pinch over the strings. And you want to make sure that you're not just trying it down here because that's the hardest place to do it on the ukulele, but you can take those bars and move them up and try different places to get comfortable before then you move down to work with them. So combining these approaches with bar chords alongside these new approaches with our strumming, where we talked about using our nails to create a brighter sound and the pads to create a warmer sound, alongside accents, which is the act of playing a note louder occasionally to prioritize it. With all of that, you become a really good partner to play with somebody who's maybe singing or in a band or accompanying somebody else. It can sound so great when you incorporate these sort of concepts in your ukulele playing. And you go from sounding something like, maybe this, to maybe somebody who sounds more like this. I'm just kind of using some bar chords, using some of those open finger strums, some of the accents, some of the nail strums, and you can just hear it sounds so much more professional, doesn't it? It just sounds so much richer depending on what you want to kind of communicate with your ukulele playing. So I'm going to open it to questions now to see if you guys have any questions with these techniques that we're working on, or any questions from our previous sessions as well. So if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand and go from there. So any questions at all?
I have a question. The question is, what happens to your thumb? My thumb actually gets quite sore. I must be pushing on the back of the stem too hard.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And so question is, what happens to my thumb? It gets sore as I'm playing this, right? And one thing I'll say is that's to an extent normal. So you will actually get more strength in the hand as you work on this. A little bit of soreness is to be expected. Just like anything else, you start, going hiking, your feet will be sore as you're learning to do it. Same type of deal. However, usually the reason the thumb is hurting is because you're pushing too hard, just like what you said. And so when you're doing that bar chord, one of the things that I find helps is we talked about kind of pushing, right? When you're pushing in like this, the thumb is usually braced behind and you're death gripping this sort of thing, right? And so if we remove the ukulele for just a second, as funny as this is, and we think about that death grip that's happening, well, what you want to do in addition to that is pull back a bit. And that alleviates the pressure between these and kind of uses the hand positioning just a little bit to pinch on that string. So like right here on this B flat, I'm pushing so hard. And if you listen to my A string, it's not quite there. So I'm going to just push harder and harder and harder and harder, and it starts to make a better sound. But instead of pushing like that, you see how the knuckles are turning white, right? What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to pull back just a little bit to try to pinch that A string. It's not a big pullback motion like this, just a little bit of that. And usually that can be enough to start to offset some of the pressure. You might even feel more pressure in the thumb at first when you're doing that, and that's normal too. But then you can start to alleviate the amount of force you're applying on the fingers to the point where it becomes easier to play. I will say that playing bar chords for long periods of time, it hurts. Like, just showing you this in the last 20 minutes, my thumb doesn't feel, great. My thumb is a little bit sore. I can do this for a long time, but I've been training most of my life to do this, right? And it still will be like, oh yeah, I was just playing a lot of chords, a lot of bar chords, and we'll feel that sort of, burn in there. So my general rule of thumb, get it, pun, is that some discomfort is okay, pain is not. So if you're finding that when you're practicing, your thumb is just a little, tender, doesn't like it that much, that's okay. But as soon as you start getting pain, as soon as you get that, everyone knows pain, then want to back off, look at what you're doing, take breaks, and kind of go from there. Do not expect yourself to be able to practice this for like 15 straight minutes when you first learn it, because it's a lot of work. I remember when I was in college, I was studying jazz stuff, and I'd be playing a lot of comping stuff where I'd be, doing these big bar chords or whatever. And I had to play all the time, and I would be doing it for hours on end of doing these bar chords and playing, and my hand got into really good shape because of that. And then I stopped because, no one goes to school forever. Well, maybe some people do, but I didn't. And then a few years later, I had a friend who wanted to do some jazz stuff. I was like, oh yeah, sure. And so we started jamming, and like 20 minutes in, my hand was just on fire. It was just like, wait a minute, I used to do this for hours. What's happening right now? Well, you don't use it, you lose it. And for me, it was that strength in the thumb with those bar chords. So Yeah, so it's normal to have some discomfort. It's kind of a long answer to your question, but the gist of it is try pushing in different ways, pulling back a bit, and know that a little bit of discomfort is normal with this as you're practicing. So, any other questions at all? Doesn't look like it. Oh, yes, June.
So what are you losing or sacrificing musically by skipping the bar D7 and going to the Hawaiian, the 2020 chord? Because I hate the D7, that one.
Yeah, and a quick question for your question: Do you hate playing it, or do you hate the sound of it, or both?
Both.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's fine.
It's hard. It's hard to do this one, especially quickly. And it's easier to do this quickly.
Yeah, for sure. So it's a fantastic question. The question was, what are you losing musically by doing what a lot of people have called the Hawaiian D7, which is playing your D7 like this, 2-0-2-0, with your index finger on the second fret of the G string and middle finger here on the second fret of the E. What do you lose doing this versus this, right? And on a music theory level, it's kind of funny. This the reason that this is called the Hawaiian D7 is because it's not a D7 at all. It's actually an F sharp diminished chord. And the reason for this is simple. It sounds crazy, but if you play this D7, the notes you're playing are D, F sharp, A, and C. Those four notes, D, F sharp, A, and C, create a D7 chord. Now, if you take the D away and you just played F sharp, A, and C, which is what you're doing here, you're just flipping the C note to be on the bottom string instead, the lower string. Now you're only playing the notes F sharp, A, and C, which is an F sharp diminished chord. An F sharp diminished triad is what it's called. And so there's no D in it. So it's not even a D7. Well, it still functions as it, right? And if you're playing in a band or something, the bass player is probably going to be playing that D note, so you're fine anyways. And everything is about context. So if I play this chord all by itself, it might not sound like the D7. But if I play it within a chord progression, it might sound just as good as that D7 does, even though it doesn't contain the D note. So the sacrifice you're making with this Hawaiian D7 is you're not playing a D7 anymore. You're playing an F sharp diminished, even though it functions as that D7. I believe it's called the Hawaiian D7 mainly because in Hawaiian schools, when they're taught the ukulele, they're taught this D7 chord early on because it's easier for kids to play than doing that full bar and doing that full process. One of the reasons why you might like this sound more is the organization of the notes. It's very tense, but it's also very closed. The lowest note's the C and the highest note's the A. So it doesn't have as big of a range as this one, which goes from that D to that C. And you can hear, this one sounds almost a little more bluesy, doesn't it? You know, it's more prominent. And so a lot of people don't like it for that reason. I do think it's worth practicing this though. What I actually did when I was learning the ukulele is I did this little chord progression. I'll show it to you guys right now as something that you can try. It goes from a C chord to an E7, which is going to be 1, 2, 0, 2, index on one of the G, middle on 2 of the C, and ring here on 2 of the A. And then to an A7, taking your index, move it to the first fret of the C string, take the other fingers off, so it's 0, 1, 0, 0. And you're going to give this for 2 bars. And then you're going to go to D7. So we don't want to do the Hawaiian D7. We want to do that full-blown D7, 2, 2, 2, 3. And then from here it goes to G7, which is 0, 2, 1, 2. Middle finger on the second fret of the C string, index on the first fret of the E, ring on the second of the A. And then you go back to a C chord. And then you can go back to a G7 if you want. And repeat the whole thing. And so it sounds something like this. It goes like 1 bar of C, 1 bar of E7, 2 bars of A7, 1 bar of D7, 1 bar of G7, 1 bar of C, 1 bar of G7. It sounds like this. You can use your different our different strum techniques and things, but this chord progression, it's actually the song 5'2". It was the first thing I ever learned on the ukulele, And I'm so thankful I learned this verse because I didn't know anything else or any better. So that D7 was so hard, but I had to learn it because it was the only thing I knew. And it's very inefficient. Going from this A7 to this D7 to this G7, it's not an efficient transition. And that's exactly what makes it such a good exercise. So even if you just sit there and kind of go A7, D7, G7, C, and do it the different ways, it can be really great to get that chord more comfortable. But yeah, a D7's a tricky one, and the song just doesn't sound as good when you go. And just, it needs that brightness of this version. So are there any other questions at all? Don't see any questions. But as always, these recordings are always going to be made available later. And so if you have any questions, if you're watching this as a YouTube recording, I try to look back at the comments there to try to catch them. And if I see your comment, I'll try to answer it in the beginning of our next lesson here. But we meet every first and third week of the month. And so this was the session on February 18th, 2022, which is just crazy that we're already there. And our next session will be on March 4th in 2022. And so I'll look forward to seeing you guys there. And be sure, again, to let me know if you have any questions in the comments. So thanks so much. Hope you guys have a great weekend.
Let's sing a song and share a little hope today. La 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 la.